Hi everybody. As Oscar Wilde once said, to love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. What he didn't say is that to commit to loving oneself may result in a lot of media attention and over 50 wedding proposals from men all over the world. This is me on my wedding day in March 2014. I decided that a self-marriage would be the best way to make some solid commitments to myself. As we're talking about Tomorrow Imagined, I'd like to share how doing a self-marriage helped me imagine and create the next phase of my life. And there are many, many reasons why I decided to marry myself, and many of those reasons only became apparent in hindsight. To set the scene, I was 30 when I made the decision, and I'd been having a great time throughout my 20s. I'd partied lots, I'd travelled lots, I had great friends, I'd started a career as a photographer. But as some of you may have also experienced, as I got closer to 30, I started to think, is there maybe a little bit more to life? Are there things I should be thinking about? Questions like, who am I, what am I doing, and maybe I should become a little bit more of a responsible human being. At this time, I'd also been single for around 6 years, and it had occurred to me that if I'd been with another person for 6 years, I'd probably want to make some sort of a commitment to them, to celebrate the journey that I'd been on, and to make some commitments for the future. So why would I not do the same thing for myself? So the decision to marry myself was also seen as a kind of rite of passage. And I'm not a religious person, but I do have spiritual beliefs. So for me, the marriage as a structure was the most accurate way to symbolise the kind of agreements that I wanted to make with myself. And the decision to have people present at the wedding was an important one because not only did it help me take the day a lot more seriously, it also meant that there would be people who could remind me of the things that I had committed to do when I might forget them in the future. So in order to create a self-marriage, the first thing I did was set a date. And I gave myself about 5 months. And naturally, I did absolutely nothing for the first 4. Left everything to the last minute. Didn't give people very long to plan to come or not. And I realised that the February before that March, I started to feel generally quite rubbish about myself and thinking, what am I doing? Is this even a good idea? What's this all about? And then it occurred to me that I must be having last-minute wedding jitters. So it's no different if you marry yourself. So then I was given, a friend lent me their farmhouse in Devon to have the ceremony in, and that was really great. And a good friend of mine had just finished training to be a non-denominational celebrant. And so I asked her if she would be the celebrant for the wedding. And it was really great because she does lots of different ceremonies for different people, and she really understands what happens at a wedding, and I don't, because I hadn't actually been to that many weddings myself. A lot of my friends would marry abroad and then come back, and then everybody would have a big party together. But it was really helpful for her to say, well, normally this happens, and then this happens, and I'd say, oh, no, I don't want that bit. Yes, that sounds brilliant, we'll go for that. And the day itself was great. Lots of people arrived. I had 7 best women, a man of honour. I went all out. But the most lengthy and the most difficult part of the entire process was coming up with my vows. And I don't think I finalised the wording until the morning of the wedding itself. And my vows were to take excellent care of myself, practically, financially, and physically, to support my creative practice, to nourish my adventurous spirit, to take more risks in matters of the heart, and to commit to my own journey of personal transformation so that I could help everybody else do the same. And I was telling this story in Bristol a few months back, and as I said the 4th vow, which is to take more risks in matters of the heart, a woman in the audience cracked up laughing. And it was really infectious. She was laughing, I started laughing, everybody else started laughing. And then she came up to me in the break and she said, I'm really, really sorry. I hope you don't think that I was laughing at you. She said, but it just occurred to me that what's more risky than marrying yourself? I thought, well, I've not really thought about this before. And she was recently divorced, and she said that the notion of a self-marriage had given her quite a lot of things to think about. And I then discussed this with friends after, because I hadn't quite understood what she meant by what's more risky. So my friend said to me, Grace, listen, you don't have a get-out clause. If you marry another person, you can divorce them and leave them, and you may never have to see them again ever if you don't want to. She said, you're stuck with yourself now, and even if you decide to have a symbolic divorce, you have to live with yourself. She's like, oh yeah, that's true, yeah. So it was, yeah, that was quite funny. But just to try and describe is very difficult how it feels to go into a room full of people who've travelled from different places to come and be with you and celebrate you being the best person you can be, the healthiest person you can be, and the most loving person that you can be towards yourself is incredibly humbling and very overwhelming. So once the ceremony itself had finished, we'd eaten, we'd had a big party, the next morning I thought, I just want to go home and get back to reality and carry on with normal life. And I chatted about it with a few friends, I shared a few photos, and that was it. And so for the next 6 months, life went on. I didn't think about it very much. And then Tate, the celebrant, was doing a presentation at a festival, and she said, oh, my first job was marrying my friend Grace to herself. And in the audience was a journalist who then approached me and wrote a piece for the Guardian newspaper, which was published in October of the same year, 2014. And I thought, few people will see this, it will go around Facebook a little bit. It might, be picked up by people who still actually read newspapers. And that would be it. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because overnight it had been translated into about 25 languages. My inbox was completely full. I was in shock. I had no idea what had happened. And there were all sorts of versions of what I'd done to varying degrees of accuracy all over the internet and in lots of newsstands. And 24 hours later, I was asked to go on the BBC4 Today programme, which is possibly the most intimidating place to start a media career. And I sat down and I had to wait for my turn, and there was a man who was an expert in kidnapping in the Middle East, and he was discussing a kidnapping. There was also a man who was talking about some nuclear waste that had started leaking in the southeast of England, and then it was me talking about self-marriage. It was so bizarre. And by the end of that day, I'd been interviewed for Russian primetime television, and I'd been booked onto TV shows in Australia. And naturally, throughout that week, there were lots of different opinions coming in and lots of different conversations happening by different people who had different opinions on what I'd done. Very divided, shall we say. There were people who thought that this was completely ridiculous, and there were people that loved it. And I very quickly learned that it was incredibly important that I stay very centred and I don't get too distracted by the criticism and I don't get too distracted by the praise. And I just do my best to stay sane, which is what I did. And then a few days later, I was invited to go to LA to do a chat show in Hollywood in Paramount Studios. And when the producer called me on the phone, she said, oh, the show's called Doctors. And so I was immediately very suspicious. Are you going to psychoanalyse me on live television? Are you going to make me look silly? And she said, no, we think this is brilliant. And when I got there, there was a psychologist who'd been brought in to give his 2 pennies worth on what I'd done. And he said, Grace, I'm not going to lie, when I did hear about your story, I thought this must be a classic case of narcissistic personality disorder. I said, yes, I've heard that word a few times this week. And he said, well, actually, I now know from talking to you that you didn't know any of this media exposure was going to occur. I said, no, of course not. This was a private ceremony amongst friends, and then people got interested. And he said, well, that makes you the opposite of a narcissist. And I could have hugged him in that moment. That was such a nice thing to hear. And at the end of the trip to Hollywood, I got an email asking if I could go to the Middle East and do a live news programme in Lebanon. So I went over to Lebanon, and everything was looking great. Things were looking fine. Everybody was lovely. The presenter sounded nice. And she said to me on the phone, we're going to have some fun. It's going to be great. And I thought, okay. When I sat down, we had a nice conversation, the same questions were occurring. The main one being, are you able to marry anybody else? This is everybody's biggest fear. So I'm just going to nail this now. Being self-married is not legally binding. And if I decide to marry another person, then I will not be a bigamist, and I am allowed to date. So I just want to clear that up, because this is the most common question. So after she'd asked me all those questions, she said, well, Grace, she said, you're an interesting woman, you're very intelligent, you're funny, you're attractive, and now you have a husband. And my jaw just fell. I said, what, could you explain what you mean? She said, well, you have a husband, he's waiting for you, would you like to meet him? And I had to politely, skillfully, turn this lady's proposition down. I said, well, actually, it's better if he writes me a letter, and if I like what he says, then I'll consider responding to him. And that's exactly what I said. And she did keep trying, and I got away with it. But one of the other things that had happened throughout this whole period was a variety of different wedding proposals of varying levels of detail were coming to me in any way that people could find. And it was very funny, because I think there's one which was very much about, I'm lonely and you're lonely too, aren't you? So let's get together. And one, I never said I was lonely, I'm actually feeling quite good at the moment. And two, it's not the most attractive proposition in the world. But it also brings in that deeper question of whether or not you are complete if you're 30 and single. And there were people on my journey that seemed to think that there was something kind of worrying about this. So that's something that's definitely been, I've met that opinion on a few occasions. And I find it very interesting. And I find it really, really interesting that so many people were interested in self-marriage. Because to me, obviously, I did this for myself, and then it blew up. So the amount of conversations I was having with people, the amount of different opinions, and that was 2 years ago. And it seems at the moment there is another resurgence, because my inbox has been getting full recently again. I've had some offers from news outlets to do more interviews recently. And it seems that it's a growing trend for women in particular. I've only ever heard of one man who's considering making a commitment to himself in this way. But there are women around the world who've been in the headlines in the last few years. There's a lady in Texas who said if she got to 40 and she hadn't met the man of her dreams, that she would marry herself. And she did, at the Houston Museum of African American Culture. There's a lady in Brighton who invited the public to come and join her in her self-marriage at an arts festival. There's even a celebrant now in Australia who specialises in self-marriage. So it's interesting that it's mostly women, but it's not that surprising, because given the history and the meaning of marriage for women, I think until 1882 in the UK, a woman was technically not a separate legal entity from her husband, and she certainly couldn't buy, sell, or own any property in her own right. And these kinds of unconscious beliefs take quite a long time to transform, and it seems at the moment that people of all genders are finding really interesting ways to create and celebrate the types of relationship that they're in. And same-sex marriage has now been legalised in more places in the world. And also heterosexual couples are tweaking and adapting the traditional customs to make it better suit who they are. And I was at a wedding this summer in Italy, and the bride stood up and she said, "It's very important for me that I challenge the traditional silence of women at weddings by making a speech at the dinner." And that went down really, really well. It was brilliant to be a part of. But what I really love doing is talking to people that I would normally not have much to say to. So my great auntie Jo called me up a few months back. She's very Catholic. And she said, "Grace, I've just been chatting to Sister Mary from the convent next door, and I've showed her your article about self-marriage, and she thinks it's absolutely brilliant." And before I knew it, I was on the phone to Sister Mary. And she said, "Well, I think it's so fantastic." She said, "It's, from a Catholic perspective, this is brilliant. And it's not that different from my ordination ceremony, which I saw as an inner marriage." And I understood what she meant. even though I have absolutely no intention of joining a nunnery or taking any vows of celibacy, I love that self-marriage has enabled us to have these kinds of conversations. So it's very difficult for me to pin down exactly what the effect of being married to myself has had on my life. Just like it is with any marriage, I guess. But I can say that it has made me much more self-confident, much clearer on who I am and what I want in life. It's helped me move forward with a lot more clarity, and it's definitely given me a much stronger sense of self, and one that's much less dependent on what other people think of me. And being in the media to that extent has really helped with that. So whilst I'm sure that everybody here is not going to rush off and marry themselves, it's a really great exercise to stop and think, if you were to marry yourself tomorrow, what would your vows be? Thank you.